From gilded palaces to modern day press briefings, there's one truth that hasn't changed. The moment the crowd is looking for you, your absence becomes the headline. Welcome to This Again. I'm your host, Mallory Faust, and today we're talking about leaders who vanish in the very moments they're needed most. But here's the twist: in the past, showing up could literally just mean showing up. Stand on a balcony, wave, and people would feel reassured. Today, the balcony has Wi Fi. The crowd has smartphones. And the second you appear, they want more than a wave. They want answers, receipts, and proof that you're actually doing something. So, why do leaders, especially those whose power is largely symbolic, keep disappearing in a crisis? The easy answer is ego, or incompetence, or maybe a total misread of the public mood. But the deeper answer, it's history. So let's rewind and let's get started. There was a time when kings, queens, and emperors weren't just decorative, they were active rulers. Think medieval monarchs leading armies in person, or Renaissance rulers directly negotiating treaties. Their authority was immediate, personal, and often bloody. But over centuries, especially in Europe, something shifted. As parliaments grew stronger, constitutions took hold, and bureaucracies expanded. Monarchs were quietly sidelined from the actual mechanics of governance. What was left was the image of power: ceremonial ribbon cuttings, speeches from the throne, carefully staged moments meant to signal continuity, stability, and unity. Think about what that really means. Instead of commanding armies or drafting laws, the job became things like opening parliament with a scripted speech someone else wrote, hosting state dinners where the menu was decided by a chef, not the crown, presiding over parades, christenings, weddings, the kinds of things that look grand on a postcard but don't exactly decide the fate of nations. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many monarchs were essentially political mascots. They still wore the crown, but someone else was holding the reins. Take Queen Victoria, for example. During Queen Victoria's reign, real political power had already shifted to Parliament and the Prime Minister. Her duties? Endless ceremonies, opening Parliament by reading a speech written entirely by her ministers, attending military reviews where she inspected troops she didn't command, and spending hours receiving foreign ambassadors to shake hands and exchange rehearsed platitudes. The problem is, when your main job is to be a symbol, the one thing that you cannot afford to do is vanish. Because when you vanish, the symbol collapses with you. If you're the father of the nation, your absence feels like abandonment. If you're the mother of the people, disappearing during a crisis feels like neglect. Historian David Carradine describes monarchy as, quote, the theater of power. But theater only works when the actors show up for the performance. And here's where the trouble begins. If you've been trained for years, sometimes for your entire life, to believe your role is ceremonial, you might think your presence isn't truly required in moments of chaos. You might even believe that showing up without a concrete solution could make you look weak. The irony? In a symbolic leadership, the appearance of weakness is almost always preferable to the appearance of absence. The case studies we're looking at today span over 200 years. They happen in different countries, under different political systems, with wildly different kinds of leaders, but they all share the same fatal miscalculation. They underestimated the emotional weight of their own presence. Marie Antoinette in 1789 chose to face the mob and bought herself a fleeting moment of goodwill. Tsar Nicholas II in 1917 stayed away until it was too late and lost his throne without ever facing his people. The British royal family during COVID waited weeks before stepping into a vacuum of fear and uncertainty. And then there's Emperor Hirohito during World War II, where we'll flip all of this on its head. These leaders were all, in one way or another, products of a system that had taught them to see their position as symbolic. And when crisis hit, they defaulted to the rules of symbolism, thinking their absence wouldn't matter, or that a delayed, controlled appearance would have more impact. But the public's expectations have changed. Where once away from the balcony could buy you months of goodwill, today people demand instant acknowledgement, visible engagement, and real time accountability. The lesson? In the theater of power, you can't skip the performance and expect the audience to stick around. That's our frame for today's episode. Let's start in 18th century France with a queen who, for one brief moment, understood exactly what it meant to show up. It's October 5th, 1789. It's been just 3 months since the storming of the Bastille, the symbolic start of the French Revolution. Tensions are still high. Bread prices have skyrocketed. Hunger is everywhere. That morning, thousands of women, mostly market women from Paris, began a march toward Versailles in what becomes known as the Women's March on Versailles. Their demand is simple: bread. But underneath that is a demand for justice, fairness, and acknowledgement from their rulers. Many have babies strapped to their backs, others carry baskets, pikes, or muskets, and some have knives hidden in their skirts. Their faces are hard, their voices hoarse from shouting, and what begins as a march for bread, with each mile, becomes a march for justice, and possibly for blood. By the time they reach the gilded gates of Versailles, they've been joined by more revolutionaries, men from the National Guard, Parisian militants, and political agitators. The crowd swells to tens of thousands. Versailles itself was like another planet compared to Paris. Marble, chandeliers, manicured gardens that stretched for miles, but the people marching toward it weren't arriving to be dazzled. They were arriving to demand that the reality be acknowledged. Imagine trudging through rain and mud, the cold biting your fingers, your stomach hollow from days of rationed bread, and then suddenly there's gold leaf everywhere. You're staring through the iron gates at rooms lined with silk, knowing the woman who lives there has never felt hunger in her life. That contrast, hunger outside, abundance inside, didn't just stoke resentment. It turned the palace into a stage, the queen into a performer, and the marchers into an audience primed for confrontation. In that moment, optics were everything, and Versailles was the most expensive backdrop in Europe. Inside the palace, Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, is 34 years old. She's been a lightning rod for public resentment for over a decade, blamed for everything from France's crushing debt to her supposed indifference toward the poor. She's mocked as Madame Deficit, caricatured as frivolous, foreign, and obsessed with fashion. The truth is more complicated than that, but in politics, and especially in revolutions, perception often matters more than fact. And part of the reason perception mattered so much was that the monarchy itself had become more symbol than substance. Louis XVI, in theory, was an absolute monarch, but by the late 1780s, he was hemmed in on all sides by parliaments that blocked his reforms, by nobles who refused to give up tax privileges, and by financial systems groaning under war debts he couldn't fix. He wore the crown, but the real levers of governance were jammed. Marie, meanwhile, had no constitutional authority at all. Queens of France weren't supposed to govern, their role was ceremonial, yet her visibility made her the lightning rod for criticism. The gowns, the gambling, the supposed indifference, the monarchy had become theater, and Marie Antoinette was cast in the starring role, whether she wanted it or not. So when the mob came to Versailles, what they were demanding wasn't a new law or decree. They wanted a symbolic performance, proof that their suffering had been seen. When the mob breaches the gates and chaos erupts in the courtyards, Marie Antoinette has two options. One is to stay inside, safe behind palace guards, and hope the situation resolves without her. Two, step out onto the balcony in full view of the people who've been calling for her head and face them herself. Now, Marie Antoinette didn't wake up that morning ready to stand on a balcony and face down a mob. Just hours earlier, she had been fleeing barefoot through the palace corridors in her nightgown, her guards cut down behind her bedchamber torn apart by intruders. She was terrified, hiding in the king's apartments while the shouting of thousands echoed through Versailles. By morning, the king himself had stepped out onto the balcony. The crowd roared, but then came the demand. La reine, la reine. They wanted the queen. Lafayette, commander of the National Guard, urged her forward. This wasn't so much a choice as it was survival theater. She could hide and let the crowd imagine her as the monster from the pamphlets, or she could step outside and try to rewrite the story. So she came out, pale, visibly shaken, but composed. At first, she was flanked by her two children, but Lafayette whispered that the gesture would look braver if she stood alone. She nodded, sent the children back inside, and bowed her head. And that's when it happened. Silence, followed by shouts. Vive la reine! Weapons lowered, and some in the crowd even bowed back. It wasn't forgiveness. It certainly wasn't reconciliation, but it was a moment, a brief flicker of goodwill wrung from chaos. The irony is, it wasn't entirely her idea. She had been forced out by circumstance by Lafayette and the crowd itself, but history doesn't usually care about why you show up, only that you did. Now, historians debate how much this moment actually mattered. Some say it bought the monarchy precious time, allowing for a more controlled transition toward a constitutional monarchy. Others argue it was little more than theater, a symbolic gesture that had no real effect on the revolution's momentum. But what's undeniable is this: she showed up, and for leaders whose role is primarily symbolic, showing up can be the most powerful move left in the playbook. Of course, it didn't save her in the long run. By 1793, Marie Antoinette was a prisoner in the Conciergerie prison. She faced trial for treason, theft, and even an obscene and false charge of incest against her young son, a smear tactic designed to destroy her morally as well as politically. On October 16, 1793, she was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Witnesses say she walked to the scaffold with dignity, her white hair cut short, wearing a plain chemise. Her final words were an apology to her executioner as she stepped on his foot. Quote, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." The bow on the balcony was no defense in the courtroom. It didn't erase years of political resentment, but the moment has endured in historical memory because it was a rare instance of a monarch choosing to stand in the open rather than hide. Now, if Marie Antoinette shows us the high-risk gamble of showing up and how it can buy you a fleeting measure of goodwill, the next part will show us the opposite, the fatal miscalculation of staying away entirely. Now it's winter of 1916. World War I is grinding Russia into the ground. The army is starving. Ammunition is scarce, and millions of Russian soldiers are dead or wounded. Back home, food shortages and inflation are choking the cities. And yet, Tsar Nicholas II, the autocratic ruler of the Russian Empire, is 400 miles away from Petrograd at his military headquarters in Mogilev. It's not symbolic absence. He has literally removed himself from the center of political life. When Nicholas took personal command of the Russian army in 1915, it was meant to be a show of leadership. In practice, it was a disaster. Not only was he an inexperienced military commander, but his absence from the capital left the government in the hands of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, and her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin. To the people of Petrograd, it looked like the Tsar had abandoned them to chaos. By early 1917, food lines in the capital were turning violent. Strikes were erupting, and protesters filled the streets chanting for bread, for peace, for the end of the autocracy as a whole. Members of the Duma, Russia's parliament, sent urgent messages to Nicholas. The city was on the brink of revolution. Nicholas didn't come. Instead, he issued orders to suppress the unrest, by force if necessary, and soldiers were told to fire on demonstrators, and some obeyed, others mutinied. By March, the situation was spiraling. Nicholas finally boarded a train for Petrograd, intending to return and reassert control. But revolutionaries and striking railway workers blocked the tracks. His train was forced to stop, reverse course, and reroute to the small town of Pskov. Imagine that train, the last Tsar's personal rail car, sitting motionless on a track surrounded by snow and silence. Inside, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension, courtiers murmuring in corners, and outside, revolutionaries and striking railway workers blocking the line. Not with weapons of war, but with the sheer fact of their refusal to move. It's not a battle scene, it's a chokehold. And the man in the imperial uniform is watching his empire slip away, mile by mile, without a single shot being fired. Now, if Marie Antoinette's balcony was a stage, Nicholas's train was a slow-moving exit, and the audience had already decided to leave before the performance was over. It was there on March 15, 1917, that Nicholas made the decision to abdicate the throne. Now, the abdication did not happen in a grand public ceremony. There was no balcony, no final address to the people he claimed to be the, quote, little father of. Instead, there was a telegram, and it was dull, bureaucratic, and almost painfully anticlimactic. It reads, quote, "In agreement with the Imperial Duma, we have thought it best to abdicate the throne of the Russian state and to lay down the supreme power. Not wishing to be separated from our beloved son, we bequeath our succession to our brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, and bless him to mount the throne of the Russian Empire." End quote. It read like a man excusing himself from a dinner party, not like the last Tsar of Russia acknowledging a collapse of a 300-year-old dynasty. For Russians who saw the Tsar as the little father, this was more than bad politics. In psychological terms, it was abandonment. The very figure who symbolized stability had vanished from their lives. And once people feel abandoned by a symbolic parent, their loyalty collapses fast. Michael Alexandrovich refused the crown, and ultimately, the monarchy was over. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest, and for over a year, they were moved from one location to another. Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg. They lived under guard, cut off from the outside world, while civil war raged across Russia. Just after midnight on July 17, 1918, the guards woke the family and told them they were being moved for safety. Instead, they were herded into a cramped basement in the Ipatev house. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 attendants. Chairs were brought in so Alexandra, weakened by illness, could sit, and the children followed her lead. A statement was read sentencing them to death. Nicholas barely had time to ask a question before the first shots rang out. And from there, it was chaos. The firing squad was poorly organized. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls, filling the room with choking smoke, and some of the guards panicked. Others were drunk, but ultimately it was over in minutes, but it wasn't clean. The most chilling detail comes from eyewitness accounts later confirmed by forensic study. The Romanov daughters didn't die in the first round. They had sewn diamonds and jewels into their corsets, a last attempt to preserve wealth in exile. Those jewels acted like armor, deflecting bullets. And after the smoke cleared, the girls were still screaming, still moving, and they were finished off with bayonets and close-range shots. The bodies were dumped into a truck, taken to a forest, burned with acid, buried, then dug up again and reburied in a second site when the first attempt went wrong. The graves weren't definitively identified until 1991, and DNA tests in the 2000s confirmed the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 children. 300 years of Romanov rule ended not on a balcony, not on a throne, but in a smoke-filled basement where even the executioners lost control of the story. The Romanovs weren't killed simply because they were inconvenient house guests. They were killed because, in the middle of a civil war, symbols mattered. The Bolsheviks feared that Nicholas, Alexandra, and even their children could be rescued by advancing white army forces and turned into a rallying banner for counter-revolution. Keeping them alive was a liability. Eliminating them was insurance. The tragedy of Nicholas II isn't just that he was overthrown, it's that he seemed to believe until the very end that his presence didn't matter, that being physically distant from his people in their moment of crisis was acceptable and even strategic. But absence, especially for a symbolic ruler, is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It reads as abandonment, and once the public feels abandoned, even a train headed back toward them might never arrive on time. And now it's time to grab your security blanket because we're traveling to March of 2020. COVID-19 at this point is shutting down entire countries. Streets are empty, borders are closing, grocery shelves are stripped bare. And for a lot of people, this is the first time in their lives they've felt the air hum with the possibility that things might not go back to normal. In the UK, the British royal family has always branded itself as a symbol of stability, the unshakable firm that carries on no matter what. Coronations, jubilees, wars, recessions, they stand on the balcony and they wave, and they reassure. So when COVID hit, you might expect them to do the same. The Queen, Elizabeth II, released a formal written statement. It was perfectly in character, polite, restrained, grateful to essential workers, but it wasn't seen. Prince Charles disappeared from public view until news broke weeks later that he had tested positive for COVID as well. Prince William stayed largely silent. Harry and Meghan were already in self imposed exile in Canada, and Prince Andrew, well, his PR problems at the time were of an entirely different and scandalous nature. What the public got in those first few weeks was essentially a vacuum, a weird, confusing silence from the one institution that literally markets itself as being there in moments of national strain. Meanwhile, everyday people were creating their own symbolic acts of resilience. In Italy, neighbors sang from their balconies in the evenings. In the US, nurses filmed themselves dancing in hospital hallways. Across the UK, children's rainbows appeared in windows, a homemade sign of hope for passersby. The absence of visible royal leadership didn't just feel strange, it felt like the crown had missed its cue. This was the first crisis of the social media monarchy. In the days after lockdown began, hashtags like "Where are they?" started popping up on Twitter. On Instagram, posts tagged with Windsor were filled with throwback photos of balcony waves from years past, captioned with things like, "Remember when they used to show up?" The criticism wasn't just about absence, it was about a broken rhythm. The public had been conditioned to expect the royal presence in hard times, and when that presence didn't come, the silence felt louder than any statement could. Psychologists studying crisis communication say that visibility itself is calming. People don't expect miracles, they just expect acknowledgement. The absence of that acknowledgement creates a kind of parasocial betrayal, which is why, when the Queen finally spoke, the words mattered less than the simple fact of her showing up. Finally, on April 5th, the Queen delivered a rare televised address. She wore a bright green dress. She invoked Vera Lynn, the singer whose wartime ballads had carried Britain through the Blitz, and she ended with the line, "We will meet again." It lasted only 4 minutes, but for many viewers, it was the first time during the pandemic they felt a flicker of collective reassurance. Not because it solved anything, but because it felt like the balcony doors had finally opened. Now, as I was writing this episode, I did have the realization that while the British crown has long been a symbol of reassurance, the royal family's delayed response has long been part of their playbook. When tragedy strikes, the pattern is almost cyclical: a silence that feels deafening, a nation that grows restless, and then finally, a carefully measured appearance that smooths things over just enough. The 1966 Aberfan disaster in Wales was one of the most famous examples of the Queen's reluctance to appear publicly. When a coal tip collapsed and buried a school, killing more than 100 children, Prince Philip arrived within a day, but the Queen waited over a week to visit. The nation noticed. Her delay was read as coldness, even indifference, but when she finally came, quiet, tearful, surrounded by grieving parents, the narrative shifted again. Her mere presence softened what absence had hardened. In later years, she reportedly said that not visiting sooner was one of her greatest regrets as monarch. And it happened again after Princess Diana's death in 1997, when her initial silence and absence from London drew anger until she finally addressed the nation. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, demanding she lower the flag and speak. When she finally did, the tension broke. Her words, quote, "What I say to you now as your queen and as a grandmother," end quote, were enough to shift the public mood from fury to forgiveness. And during COVID, of course, it happened once more. The pattern repeated: silence, outrage, and then the inevitable reappearance, poised, measured, and enough to soothe a restless public. The monarchy, it seems, has mastered the art of delayed empathy. They show up late, but they do show up. And in a world hungry for symbolic reassurance, sometimes that's still enough, until it isn't. This is where the historical through line meets a modern twist. In the 18th or early 20th century, the public might have waited days or weeks for news of a leader's presence. In 2021, they can see instantly whether you're in the trenches with them or on a beach in another country. Social media had turned symbolic leadership into a 24/7 performance review. As a leader's absence is no longer inferred through rumors, it's documented in real time with photos, hashtags, and live updates. And here's the kicker: even when leaders do appear, The expectation has shifted. Away from the balcony is not enough anymore. People want real acknowledgement, concrete empathy, and increasingly, action. If you're not on the balcony, they want to know why. And if you are on the balcony, they want to know what you're doing next. The difference now is speed. Marie Antoinette had hours to decide whether to step outside. Nicholas II had days, even weeks to respond to reports from Petrograd. Today, leaders have minutes before silence turns into a trending hashtag. The balcony still matters, but now it has Wi-Fi. There's one more story I want to leave you with, and it flips everything we've talked about on its head. Because what happens when the entire system is built on absence? That was the case in Japan during World War II. Emperor Hirohito wasn't just a monarch, he was believed to be divine, a living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His body was untouchable, his image sacred, his presence was ritualized, rare, and carefully controlled. He didn't make speeches, and he didn't appear on balconies. He obviously didn't mingle with his people, and his silence wasn't seen as neglect. It was the point. The mystique depended on distance. And for years, it worked. Soldiers carried his portrait into battle, tucked inside their cockpits. Families bowed before framed photos of him in their homes. Civilians endured starvation, fire bombings, and loss with his name on their lips. They fought for the emperor, but they never actually heard him. Invisibility was the strategy. The generals governed, the emperor was the symbol. But then came August 1945. Hiroshima reduced to ash, Nagasaki obliterated days later. The Soviets were invading from the north. Japan was teetering on collapse, and suddenly, silence wasn't enough. The divine figure would have to break his own spell. On August 15, 1945, at noon, radios across Japan crackled with static. Families gathered in silence. Some knelt, some wept before the broadcast even began, and for the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. Now, it was thin, formal, and archaic, so distant from everyday speech that many couldn't even understand it. Instead of saying, "We surrender," Hirohito said, quote, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation," end quote. And about the atomic bomb, quote, "Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization," end quote. For years, Hirohito's silence worked like a blank screen. Psychologists would call this projection. People filled the void with loyalty, devotion, and even love, but the first time they heard his real voice, the screen cracked. The god became a man, and the dissonance was almost unbearable. The words floated out of the radios in an unfamiliar cadence. Diaries from that day described the moment as surreal. One listener wrote, quote, "It was like the voice of heaven itself, soft and sad." Another recalled, quote, "We had worshipped him all our lives, and then suddenly he was human." Some people wept with relief. Others raged at the defeat. Many simply sat stunned in silence, unsure what the words even meant until local officials actually explained that Japan had surrendered. The god they had never seen and never heard had finally spoken, and what he spoke was loss. Here's the paradox. Hirohito survived. Unlike Nicholas II, he kept his throne. The Americans decided it was safer to preserve him as a stabilizing symbol during occupation than to put him on trial. But his silence had failed its test. Years of absence had created an aura so fragile that when the curtain finally lifted, the voice behind it could only disappoint. And that's the danger of building power on invisibility. It works until the day you have to show up, and then the silence collapses under its own weight. So, what do we make of all this? Marie Antoinette, facing a mob that wanted her head, chose the balcony, not out of some grand sense of leadership, but because she was cornered, and still, that fleeting moment of presence bought her a measure of goodwill. For a few minutes, weapons lowered and shouts turned to cheers, but in the long view, it was too little too late. For more than a decade, the Queen had been seen as absent from the struggles of ordinary people, detached in her gilded world at Versailles. One bow couldn't erase years of distance. Her presence in crisis was memorable, but her absence in the years before had already sealed her reputation. Nicholas II, by contrast, never had a balcony moment at all. He believed the train of empire would keep rolling without him until it was derailed in front of his eyes. His absence wasn't just miscalculation, it was literal abandonment. And the Romanovs didn't just lose power, they lost their lives, undone not only by revolution, but by their refusal to show up in the nation's darkest hour. The British royals had every advantage: centuries of tradition, PR teams, speechwriters, and still, when COVID hit, they hesitated. For weeks, silence filled the void where reassurance should have been. By the time the Queen finally appeared, her words were moving, but the delay had already spoken louder. Even in the 21st century, people don't just want policy and updates, they want presence, and they want the symbol to show up. And then there's Hirohito, the emperor whose entire power was built on absence. His silence wasn't a mistake or miscalculation, it was the system itself. His divinity depended on distance. For years, that worked. And then, when the silence finally broke, it was to announce surrender. For many Japanese people, it was the first time that they even realized he was a man. And that's the paradox. Presence can save you, even if only for a moment, and absence can destroy you, sometimes forever. And if absence is the strategy, it might hold until the one moment that it can't. Whether you're a queen on a balcony or a czar on a train, a royal in a pandemic or a divine emperor whispering through the radio, your people don't just measure you by policy or victory. They measure you by presence, by whether you stand in the open at the right time in the right way and simply say, I am here. Because when the people look for you and find nothing, the silence becomes the story. And history has never been kind to leaders who vanish. This has been This Again. I'm Mallory Faust, and while I have you, make sure to subscribe and send this to a friend who thinks optics don't matter. We'll see you next time.